The Mill at Alder Brook. Episode 5. Warm Light in the Bakehouse.
Tessa left the mill by the kitchen door and crossed the narrow path into the garden. The evening had not yet begun to darken, though the light had softened over Alder Brook. It lay warm on the upper boards of the mill and turned the leaves in the orchard a muted green. Behind her, the wheel rested in its room below the main floor. The small trial of flour it had produced was covered in a bowl between her hands. She carried the bowl carefully, not because it was full, but because there was no reason to spill any of it. The cloth over the top lifted a little in the breeze and settled again beneath her fingers. Under the cloth was enough flour for a modest loaf, pale and slightly warm when she had first gathered it, now cool after waiting in the mill kitchen. Beyond the kitchen garden, the bakehouse stood with its door closed. It was a small, plain building of timber and brick, near enough to the orchard that one low branch seemed to lean toward its roof. The oven chimney rose dark above the shingles. No smoke had passed through it for some time. Mina Holt was waiting beside the bakehouse door. She had set a shallow basket on the ground near her feet. A folded apron, 2 clean cloths, and a wooden scraper rested inside it. She greeted Tessa with a small lift of one hand, then looked toward the covered bowl. "That's the trial flour. All of it," Tessa said. "It'll be plenty." Tessa stopped beside her. For a moment they looked back across the garden toward the mill. Its windows held the last clear light. The brook could be heard beyond it, steady beneath the softer sounds of leaves and grass. Mina turned to the bakehouse door. "Shall we see how it's kept?" Tessa shifted the bowl to one arm and lifted the latch. The door resisted only slightly where its lower edge met the sill. Then it opened inward with a dry wooden sound. Cool air came from the room, carrying the mineral smell of old brick, the faint sweetness of flour left in the seams of timber, and the clean, dry scent of stored firewood. Tessa remained at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The room was simple. 2 benches ran along opposite walls. Open shelves stood above the longer one. The brick oven occupied the far corner, its iron door closed and its hearth swept. A low stack of split wood rested beside it, with thinner pieces gathered loosely in a wooden box. A few bowls stood upside down on a shelf. A long-handled oven peel leaned where the brick met the wall. Nothing seemed out of place. The bakehouse had merely been resting. Tessa stepped inside and set the flour on the nearer bench. A fine layer of dust showed where the bowl displaced it. Mina followed with the basket and left the door wide enough for the evening air to pass through. The floor gave one quiet creak beneath them and then became still. Mina ran 2 fingers over the edge of the bench. "Mostly closed room dust. That's what I hoped." Tessa uncovered the bowl. The flour had remained level during the walk. In the softer light of the bakehouse, it looked almost gray. But when she moved the bowl nearer the door, its pale, warm color returned. Mina pinched a little between her finger and thumb. She rubbed it once, then let it fall back. "There's some texture left in it. The stones were only turning slowly. That won't hurt a small loaf." Tessa replaced the cloth. Testing the flour would come later. First, the room needed to be made ready around it. She took the clean cloths from Mina's basket and carried one outside to the water pitcher they had left earlier beside the door. She dampened it, wrung it over the grass, and returned. Mina tied on her apron and moved the bowls from the open shelf to the far end of the bench. They began without further discussion. Tessa wiped the shelf from one end to the other. The cloth traveled over the wood with a soft, close sound. It collected a narrow line of dust at its folded edge. She turned it and wiped again, reaching into the corners and along the back where the shelf met the wall. The wood darkened beneath the damp cloth. Its grain became clearer for a few moments, showing old marks from bowls and jars, then lightened gradually as the air dried it. Across the room, Mina used the scraper to lift a few small patches of flour from the longer bench. They were no more than thin, pale crescents caught beside a join in the boards. Each came away with a short stroke and fell into her cupped hand. Tessa finished the first shelf and moved to the second. She lifted the bowls one at a time, wiping beneath them before returning them upside down. Their rims made quiet circles against the wood. One large mixing bowl had a shallow, worn place at its base, and settled there as though it had been standing in the same position for years. The evening air moved through the open door. It cooled Tessa's wrists where she had pushed back her sleeves and brought the sound of the brook into the room. Now and then an orchard leaf turned and showed its paler underside. Nothing else disturbed the garden. Mina finished scraping the bench and dampened the second cloth. "There's less to do here than I expected," she said. John left it orderly. He usually did. They said nothing more about the retired miller. His good habit was already visible in the swept hearth, the covered kindling box, and the tools left where a hand would naturally reach for them. Tessa wiped the shorter bench around the covered flour. When she needed to clean beneath the bowl, Mina lifted it with both hands. Tessa passed the cloth over the round, pale mark, waited while the dampness faded, and nodded. Mina set the bowl down again in the clean space. They worked toward the oven by degrees. The bricks around the oven mouth were cool. Tessa held the back of her hand near them, feeling no stored warmth. She opened the iron door and looked inside. The chamber was dark, swept, and dry. There was a little gray ash gathered in one corner, fine enough to have escaped the last brushing. Mina brought the hearth brush. Tessa stood aside while she drew the ash forward in slow strokes. The bristles whispered over brick. A faint dry scent rose and disappeared through the open door. Mina gathered the ash onto the small shovel and carried it to the covered metal pail near the entrance. Tessa crouched beside the wood stack. The pieces were dry, though they had been placed unevenly when the bakehouse was last closed. Some had slid forward. One rested across the others instead of with them. She removed it and began to rebuild the stack, placing the larger pieces below and the lighter ones above. Each piece felt smooth where it had split cleanly and rough along the bark. The wood made hollow, satisfying sounds as it settled. Tessa kept the cut ends facing outward so their size could be seen at a glance. She left a clear space between the stack and the brick, and another between the stack and the walking path. Mina returned the empty shovel to its hook. Then she knelt beside the kindling box and sorted the thinner pieces. The driest slips went together on one side. A few curled shavings were gathered into a shallow basket. Nothing was thrown away. Even the shortest pieces would serve when they began warming the oven. They did not mean to bring it to baking heat at once. Old brick was better treated gently after a rest. A little fire would take the chill away. Another, added later, would warm the deeper brick. There would be time to mix the dough between those stages and time to let it rest while the oven settled. Tessa stood and brushed a fleck of bark from her palm. "That should be enough wood for tonight," Mina said, "and some left ready for the next use." Mina looked at the stack. More than some. It was a small observation, almost a joke, and Tessa smiled. They moved the cleaned bowls back to the long bench. Mina placed the large mixing bowl in the center. Beside it, she set the scraper and one folded cloth. Tessa found a small crock for salt and put it near the bowl, though she left its lid closed. The water pitcher remained outside in the cool air until it was needed. There was comfort in seeing the bench take on an ordinary arrangement. A few minutes earlier, it had been an unused surface in a closed room. Now each thing suggested the next simple action. Mina crossed to the doorway and looked out. Good drying weather. The light had lowered over the kitchen garden. The mill's shadow stretched toward the first rows of plants, while the upper leaves of the orchard still held the sun. Somewhere beyond the mill wall, Alder Brook past the wheelroom and continued downstream. Tessa joined her at the door. From here, the mill and bakehouse seemed to belong to one quiet circuit of work. Grain had been stored in the loft, carried down, and passed between the stones during the wheel trial. The small bowl on the bench held the result. Now it had crossed the garden to the room where flour could become something warm and useful. There was no need to prove more than that tonight. A small loaf would show how the flour took water and how it rested. The bakehouse would be opened, cleaned, and gradually warmed. If the dough wanted more time, it would be given more time. Nothing in the evening asked for haste. Tessa returned to the oven and checked the iron door once more. Its latch moved freely. The vent above it was clear. She looked up toward the chimney line, then around the room, following the familiar practical order. Open passage, clear hearth, dry wood, water within reach. Mina brought the pitcher inside and placed it near the door, away from the workbench but close enough to reach. Then she set the metal ash pail outside on the bare patch beside the step. The bakehouse was ready for its first warmth. Tessa chose 2 narrow pieces of kindling and laid them across the clean hearth with space between them. Mina added a few dry shavings, arranging them loosely so air could pass through. Over those, she placed 1 more slender piece of wood. It looked almost too small to be called a fire. That was as intended. Before lighting it, Tessa walked through the room once more. The benches were clean. The shelves were drying, the larger wood was stacked well back. The flour remained covered. The door stood open and the pitcher waited near it. Mina had already taken out the matches. She held the box toward Tessa. "You're the caretaker," she said. Tessa took 1 match. She struck it against the side of the box. The brief scratch seemed bright in the quiet room. A small flame gathered at the tip, leaned toward the open door, and steadied when she cupped her hand around it. She touched it to the dry shavings. The flame transferred easily. It moved along one curled edge, then another, making the finest wood turn dark before it began to glow. Tessa waited until the kindling had caught. Only then did she close the oven door most of the way, leaving the vent open and a narrow space for air. The first fire made no rush of heat. It gave a faint ticking sound as the nearest brick began to lose its chill. A thread of clean smoke rose through the oven and chimney. Outside, above the roof, it would be barely visible against the evening sky. Tessa stood with Mina a comfortable distance from the hearth. Warmth had not yet reached them, but the room had changed. The small sounds within the oven made the bakehouse feel occupied again. The cleaned timber carried a damp, fresh scent, and beneath it came the first trace of dry wood smoke. Mina untied her apron long enough to shake a little dust from it at the threshold, then tied it again. "We can let that settle before we add anything." Tessa nodded. "Then we'll mix." They turned toward the long bench. The covered bowl waited in the center beside the larger mixing bowl, the salt crock, and the folded cloth. The first shelf was already nearly dry. Beyond the open doorway, the path through the kitchen garden remained clear in the lowering light leading back toward the mill. For now, neither of them needed to take it. They had arrived, opened the room, and given the resting oven its first small fire. The next part of the evening was ready for them. Flour uncovered, water measured, and a quiet interval of warmth in which to bring the dough together. Tessa lifted the cloth from the bowl of trial flour and folded it beside the larger mixing bowl. The flour had settled into a smooth, pale layer. Seen closely, it was not quite as fine as flour from a full milling. A few darker flecks remained, and the grains caught lightly against the wooden scoop when Mina drew it through the bowl. Nothing about it was troublesome. It was simply flour made while the wheel and stones were moving slowly, enough for 1 small loaf, and enough to show how the bakehouse worked after its rest. Mina tipped the flour into the mixing bowl. It fell with a soft rush, raising only the faintest dust. Tessa waited for it to settle, then added a small pinch of salt from the crock. Mina stirred the dry mixture once with her fingers, circling the bowl and lifting the flour from the bottom. Behind them, the first kindling burned quietly inside the oven. The narrow flame made a low, steady murmur. Now and then the brick gave a small tick as warmth moved farther into it. Tessa brought the water pitcher to the bench. "How much?" she asked. "Start with less than we think." Tessa poured a little into a cup. The water had kept some of the evening coolness from outside. She added it to the center of the flour, making a shallow pool, and set the cup down. Mina drew flour inward from the sides. At first, the water disappeared beneath a dry covering. Then small clumps formed around her fingers. She turned them over, pressed them gently, and drew in another sweep of flour. Tessa watched the bowl rather than the measure. The mixture was still loose at the edges and damp in the middle. She poured another small amount of water into the cup, but Mina held up one flour-covered finger. "Half of that first." Tessa added half. The dough gathered gradually. Pale crumbs joined larger pieces, and the larger pieces began to cling to one another. Mina used the wooden scraper to bring the mixture from the sides of the bowl. Each pass left a clean curve in the wood before another fold of dough covered it. For a time, the work consisted only of small adjustments. A spoonful of water, a turn of the bowl, the scraper beneath the heavy center. Dry flour drawn in from the rim. There was no moment when the mixture changed all at once. It moved by degrees from flour and water into something that could be lifted together. Mina pressed the dough with her knuckles. It yielded, though its surface remained uneven. A few rough cracks opened where the flour had not yet taken up enough water. She folded it over itself, pressed again, and looked at Tessa. "That's enough water." Tessa returned the pitcher to its place near the door. Mina scraped the dough from her fingers and gathered it into the middle of the bowl. "It'll feel a little coarse at first. Because of the slow milling? Partly. And because it's only just met the water." She turned the dough once more. "Time will do most of the work." Tessa liked the plainness of that. The flour had taken the water. The dough had gathered. It did not need to be forced smooth before it was ready. Mina covered the bowl with the clean folded cloth and left it in the center of the bench. "That's the first rest." "How long?" "Long enough to tend the oven. Then we'll feel it again." They washed the flour from their hands with a little water from the pitcher. Tessa caught the used water in a shallow basin and carried it outside. She emptied it onto bare soil at the edge of the garden path, where it darkened the earth and disappeared. The air outdoors felt cooler than it had when they arrived. The upper orchard leaves still held a narrow edge of light, but the garden was beginning to settle into shadow. Above the bakehouse roof, a thin thread of smoke rose straight for a short distance before leaning toward the brook. Tessa stood there only long enough to see that it was clean and even. Then she returned to the room. The first kindling had nearly burned down. Through the open vent, a mild warmth reached the hearth. It was not baking heat, nor anything close to it, but the iron no longer carried the deep chill it had held when they opened the bakehouse. Mina unlatched the oven door. Tessa stood back as a small breath of warm, woody air moved into the room. The remaining kindling glowed red along its edges. Mina used the poker to bring the pieces a little nearer together. Tessa selected 2 slim lengths from the ordered stack and passed them across one at a time. Mina laid them over the glow with space between them. For a few moments, nothing happened. The new wood darkened where it touched the embers. Then a narrow flame appeared beneath one piece and traveled slowly along its split edge. A second flame followed. Mina closed the door most of the way again, leaving the vent clear. "That's the next round," she said. The phrase suited the work. First warmth, first rest, then another small addition. Nothing large was asked of the oven or the dough. They cleared the bench while they waited. Tessa returned the salt crock to the shelf, and wiped the few streaks of flour from the wood. Mina cleaned the scraper, using its straight edge to gather the damp scraps before rinsing it lightly. They left the mixing bowl untouched beneath its cloth. The room had begun to feel different against Tessa's skin. The coolness remained near the floor and by the open doorway, but the air around the oven was mild. The brick gave back the first stored warmth in a steady, restrained way. It carried the scent of the new fire, without filling the room with smoke. Tessa moved the bowls on the upper shelf so that the smaller ones nested together. The worn mixing bowl remained on the bench. Beside it, Mina placed the scraper, clean and ready for the next handling. They sat for a short while on the low wooden seats beneath the opposite wall. There was no conversation to fill the interval. The oven supplied its own quiet sounds, and Alder Brook could still be heard beyond the garden. A breeze passed the doorway, stirred the hanging corner of Tessa's cloth, and went on through the orchard. Mina rested her hands loosely in her lap. A little flour remained in the lines beside one thumbnail. Tessa noticed a similar pale mark at her own wrist and brushed it away. The waiting did not feel separate from the work. It was part of it. The brick needed time to receive warmth without being hurried, and the flour needed time to receive water. While both rested, the bakehouse itself seemed to settle around them. After a while, Mina stood and touched the outside brick beside the oven door. She kept her palm there for a few breaths, warming evenly. Tessa tested another brick farther from the mouth. It was no longer cold, though it held less warmth than the first. They checked the fire. The two slim pieces had caught fully and were burning down without haste. Mina adjusted the vent a little. The flame became quieter but remained clear. Then they returned to the covered bowl. When Mina lifted the cloth, the dough looked much as it had before. Its surface was still rough, with a few small ridges left by the final fold. But when Tessa pressed one finger gently into it, the difference was easy to feel. The dough no longer resisted in separate damp and dry places. It yielded as one piece. "That's softer," Tessa said. Mina nodded. "Turn it out." Tessa dusted the clean bench with a small scattering of flour from the bottom of the first bowl. She did not use much. Mina loosened the dough with the scraper and tipped it onto the pale patch. It landed with a quiet weight. Tessa placed both hands around it. The surface was cool and slightly tacky, but it released from her fingers when she lifted them. She folded the far edge inward and pressed with the heel of one hand. Then she turned the dough and repeated the motion. Mina watched the first few folds. "Don't ask it to become smooth all at once." Tessa eased the pressure of her hands. She folded, pressed, and turned again. The dough began to change beneath her palms. Its uneven edges drew inward. The rough outer layer softened, and the small cracks became shallower. Darker flecks from the trial flour moved across the surface as it turned, appearing and disappearing with each fold. There was a comfortable rhythm in it. Draw the edge in, press forward, turn the dough a little, begin again. The bench made a low sound beneath each stroke. Flour dust gathered in a thin crescent near Tessa's right hand. Mina swept it back toward the dough with 2 fingers when it spread too far. After several turns, Tessa paused. The dough held its shape, but its surface tightened when she tried to fold it again. She pressed once more and felt it draw back beneath her palm. Mina touched the top lightly. "There it is. Too dry? No. Too much working? Not much. It's asking for another rest." Tessa looked at the small, loaf-sized piece on the bench. It was firmer than it had been in the bowl, though not hard. The surface was smoother at the center, and still a little rough near the seam. Mina turned it over and tucked the edges beneath with short movements of both hands. "The flour's drinking slowly," she said. "That's all. There was nothing to repair. No more water was needed, and no extra flour had to be worked in. The dough had come together properly. It simply needed a longer, quiet interval before shaping." Tessa cleaned the mixing bowl with the scraper. Mina placed the rounded dough back inside, seam downward, and covered it again. "How much longer this time?" Tessa asked. "Long enough for the oven to take one more small piece of wood. After that, we'll see." They left the bowl on the bench, away from the direct warmth, but no longer in the coolest part of the room. Tessa gathered the loose flour from the work surface into her palm. There was barely a spoonful. She returned what was clean to the small trial bowl and wiped the remaining trace away with the damp cloth. Mina opened the oven. Warmth reached them more clearly now. It touched Tessa's face and hands, gentle but unmistakable. The latest wood had settled into glowing pieces, with a few low flames moving between them. The brick above the oven mouth had begun to hold the warmth as well. Tessa chose one small split length from the upper part of the stack. "This one?" Mina looked at its thickness. "That'll do." Tessa placed it carefully on the embers with the poker. The wood rested at a slight angle, allowing air beneath it. Its bark gave one soft crack as the heat reached it. They closed the door again. The second rest had begun, and the next warmth was gathering. Outside, the clear evening light had thinned to a soft band beyond the orchard. Inside, the bakehouse remained orderly. Wood stacked with its ends showing, bowls clean on the shelves, water by the door, and the covered dough resting on the long bench. Tessa stood beside Mina and listened to the low fire take hold. The first round had told them what they needed to know. The trial flour would make a loaf. It needed patience, not correction. The oven was warming evenly. One modest fire after another, and the old brick had accepted the heat without complaint. There was time now to let both dough and oven continue in their own quiet way. When they next uncovered the bowl, the dough would be ready to shape, and the bakehouse would be ready to receive the deeper warmth needed for baking. Until then, everything required of the evening was already in its proper place. The covered dough remained on the long bench, while the new piece of wood settled over the embers. For a little while, Tessa and Mina did nothing, except let the bakehouse hold its warmth. The fire made a low sound behind the iron door. It was quieter than the brook beyond the garden, and closer than the leaves moving around the orchard. Between those sounds, the room seemed to breathe in an easy, ordinary way. Tessa stood near the bench with one hand resting on its clean edge. The wood beneath her palm was no longer quite cool. Warmth had traveled outward from the oven, not enough to heat the whole room, but enough to soften the chill that had gathered during the bakehouse's long rest. Mina touched the brick beside the oven mouth again. Then she moved her hand higher and tested another place. "It's reaching farther now," she said. Tessa tried the brick on the other side. The surface was gently warm near the iron frame and cooler toward the corner. There was no sharp division between the two. The warmth simply faded across the brick. They left it to continue. On the bench, the cloth over the bowl had risen very slightly at the center, where the rounded dough sat beneath it. The change was so small that Tessa could not be sure whether the cloth had moved, or whether she was only seeing it differently in the warmer light. Mina noticed her looking. "Ready to feel it?" Tessa lifted the cloth. The dough had not grown greatly. It remained a modest round in the bottom of the worn bowl, pale except for its scattered darker flecks, yet the surface had softened. The rough seam that had shown before was less distinct, and the whole piece appeared to have settled outward by a small amount. Tessa pressed one fingertip near the edge. The dough yielded easily. This time it did not tighten at once beneath her hand. The shallow mark remained for a moment and then began to fill. "There," Mina said. Tessa pressed again more lightly. It stopped pulling back. It's rested enough to listen. The words were simple, and Mina said them without making more of them than she meant. Tessa understood. Earlier, each fold had drawn a firm answer from the dough. Now it could be moved without being urged. She scattered a very thin veil of flour across the cleaned bench. There was little left in the trial bowl, and little was needed. Mina loosened the dough with the scraper, turning the bowl as she worked, until the rounded piece released and came down onto the bench with a soft, close sound. Tessa set the empty bowl aside. The dough felt different immediately. Its surface remained cool, though the room around it had warmed. When she placed both hands against it, it gave beneath her palms as one smooth piece. The coarser grains were still present, but they no longer felt separate from the rest. She folded the far side inward. The dough bent without opening along the edge. Tessa pressed gently, turned it, and folded again. No dry crack appeared. Nothing clung stubbornly to the bench. The dough lifted cleanly after each motion, leaving only a faint, dull mark that vanished when she passed her hand across the wood. Mina watched for several turns and then nodded. That's all it wanted. More waiting. Mostly. Tessa smiled a little and continued. The small discovery was not a new ingredient or a clever correction. It was only the difference made by leaving the dough alone long enough. The trial flour had seemed coarse beneath her hands at first. It had drawn tight and resisted further folding. Given a quiet interval, it had become supple without any rescue at all. That was useful to know. When the mill turned for a full sack later in the week, the flour would be more evenly ground than this trial bowl had been. Even so, its first feel would not tell the whole story. Water needed time to travel through it. A dough that felt rough at one moment might feel settled at the next, provided no one hurried to alter it. Tessa turned the dough once more. The scattered, darker flecks now made small curved paths across its surface. She drew the outer edges underneath, turning the piece between her hands while keeping the upper surface gently taut. The shape became rounder with each small movement. Not too tight, Mina said. Tessa eased her hands. Like that, like that. The finished round was not perfectly smooth. It had the honest texture of the flour from which it had been made, with a few shallow dimples and a faint line underneath where the edges met. But it held together well. When Tessa took her hands away, it remained in place. Mina brought the cleaned mixing bowl back to the center of the bench. Tessa dusted its bottom with the last loose pinch of flour. Together they lifted the shaped dough and placed it inside with the joined edges beneath. Tessa covered it again. The cloth settled over the round more evenly than before. That's another rest, she said. A shorter one this time. They both looked toward the oven. The added piece of wood had burned down enough to leave a deeper bed of embers. When Mina opened the iron door, steady warmth moved across the room. It reached the bench and Tessa's sleeves, carrying the dry scent of split wood and warmed brick. There was no smoke in the bakehouse. The chimney drew cleanly, and the remaining flame leaned inward toward the passage above the oven. Mina used the poker to spread the embers across a wider part of the hearth. Their glow showed in the dark chamber, red at the center and softer at the edges. Tessa brought 2 pieces of wood from the stack. They were a little thicker than the ones used before, though still modest enough for the gradual fire. Mina considered them. One now, she said. Keep the other ready. Tessa laid the first piece across the warmest embers. She set it so that it rested securely, with a narrow opening beneath. The split face began to darken. A thread of flame appeared along one corner, went out and returned a few moments later. They waited until it held. Mina adjusted the vent and closed the door partway. The stronger fire gave a fuller sound than the earlier rounds, but it remained contained and calm. Tessa returned the unused piece to the top of the wood stack, rather than leaving it on the floor. Its place was easy to remember, cut end facing outward. The room now had enough warmth for the next stages of the work. They did not yet need the full heat for baking. The oven would continue to gather warmth while the shaped dough rested. Later, the embers could be moved and the chamber allowed to settle into an even baking heat. Mina took the oven peel from the corner. It had been clean when they arrived. but a faint film of closed-room dust lay along the upper face. Tessa dampened a fresh fold of cloth and wiped the broad wooden blade. The grain darkened under the moisture. She cleaned the handle as far as she could reach, then handed the cloth to Mina, who held the peel while Tessa finished the other side. They leaned it near the open door to dry. Next, Mina brought down a small flatboard from the upper shelf. It was just wide enough for the loaf and worn smooth at the center. Tessa wiped it as well, paying attention to the edges and the shallow groove where flour had once gathered. The board joined the peel near the doorway. As the cleaned wood dried, they made a place for the loaf to wait after baking. Mina chose one of the clean cloths from her basket and folded it over the shorter bench. Tessa set a low wooden rack on top. Its narrow slats were smooth and evenly spaced, raising a loaf just enough for air to pass underneath. Nothing more was required there. The simple arrangement made the rest of the evening easy to see. The dough would finish resting in its bowl. It would be placed on the small board, then carried to the oven with the peel. After baking, it would cool on the rack beneath the folded cloth if the room became too drafty. Tessa found that she could picture each movement without needing to perform it early. Mina checked the dough again by lifting one corner of the covering cloth. She did not touch it. It's keeping its shape. Tessa looked into the bowl. The round had relaxed just enough to broaden at its base. The upper surface remained gently curved. They replaced the cloth. Outside, the last clear line of daylight had left the orchard. The garden path was still visible, pale between the darker beds, and the mill windows held a muted reflection of the sky. The sound of Alder Brook had become more noticeable now that the small daytime sounds were fading. Tessa went to the doorway and stood on the step. Above the bakehouse, the smoke was difficult to see. Only when it crossed the remaining light did it show as a thin gray thread. It rose cleanly, leaned over the orchard, and disappeared. The garden air cooled the warmth on Tessa's face. Behind her, the nutty oven gave a low murmur. The contrast made the bakehouse feel sheltered without feeling closed. Mina joined her at the threshold. "The chimney's drawing well," Tessa said. "It is. And the bricks are warming evenly." "They are." There was quiet satisfaction in confirming those things. The oven had rested for some time, but it had not presented them with any difficulty. Its iron door moved freely, its vent was clear, and the old brick had accepted each small fire in turn. The bakehouse had needed care, not repair. They went inside again, leaving the door open by the same narrow amount. Tessa poured a little water into the basin and rinsed the scraper. Mina dried it with the corner of her apron and returned it beside the mixing bowl. A trace of dough remained on the bench where the shaping had taken place. Tessa loosened it with the edge of the scraper, rolled the tiny piece between her fingers, and placed it with the other scraps to be cleared later. Then she wiped the surface with a barely damp cloth. The bench dried quickly in the warm room. They took their seats beneath the opposite wall once more. The waiting had changed in character. Earlier, they had waited to learn whether the flour would take the water properly. Now that question had been answered. The dough was formed and shaped. The oven was warm through more of its brick. The next interval was not uncertain. It was simply part of moving from one settled condition to another. Tessa watched the light from the narrow oven opening rest across the floorboards. It was not a bright beam, only a low amber shape near the hearth. When the flame shifted, the edge of the light moved with it. Mina sat with her hands folded loosely. Her apron carried a faint pale mark where she had dried the scraper. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The brook went on below the mill. An orchard branch stirred against another with a dry brushing sound. Somewhere in the oven, the new wood settled and released a single soft crack. Tessa thought of the bowl of flour as it had crossed the garden in her hands. It had been only the small result of the wheel trial, not enough to fill a bin or test a day's milling. Yet, it had already shown them several useful things. It held a little texture from the slowly turning stones. It took water gradually. It became firm when handled before it was ready, then softened during rest. It could be shaped without adding anything more. Each fact was modest, but together they made the flour familiar. Mina rose after a while and checked the oven brick. This time she kept her hand farther from the iron frame. The warmth had reached there as well. Nearly ready for the last warming round, she said. Tessa stood beside the covered bowl. And this? Mina uncovered it. The dough had risen only a little, as expected from such a small loaf and such a short interval. More important was the way it held the rounded form. The surface looked rested rather than tight. When Mina pressed the side gently, the dough yielded and returned slowly. "Ready for the board," she said. Tessa brought the flat board from near the doorway. It was dry now. She dusted it with the faintest remaining flour from the trial bowl, tapping the board once so the dust spread in a thin, even layer. Mina loosened the dough along the bowl with the scraper, careful not to disturb its shape more than necessary. Tessa placed one hand beneath the bowl's edge. Together they turned the dough onto the board. It settled with its joined side underneath. The loaf was small enough to fit comfortably at the center, with clear wood showing all around it. Tessa adjusted it with 2 light touches. No further shaping was needed. Mina covered the loaf with the cloth again, letting the fabric fall loosely so it would not press against the surface. Then she picked up the second piece of wood from the stack. Tessa opened the oven door. The chamber glowed over a broad bed of embers, and the surrounding brick gave back a deep, even warmth. Mina placed the final piece carefully across the center. A flame caught along its split edge and strengthened without hurry. They left the vent clear, and the iron door partly closed. The shaped loaf waited on its board. The peel was clean and dry beside the hearth. The cooling rack stood ready on the shorter bench. Nothing remained unsettled from the mixing, and nothing had been added to correct what patience had already put right. Tessa folded the empty bowl cloth and set the bowl on the clean shelf. For the next quiet interval, the fire would finish warming the oven, and the loaf would rest in its final shape. After that, they would clear the hearth, judge the settled heat, and slide the small loaf inside. The final piece of wood burned quietly across the broad bed of embers. Tessa and Mina left the shaped loaf beneath its cloth and allowed the oven to finish warming. There was no need to check either one every few moments. The brick was holding heat evenly now, and the dough had already shown that it did best when given an undisturbed interval. They sat on the low wooden seats across from the hearth. The open doorway admitted a narrow current of cool air from the garden. It moved near the floor, while the warmth from the oven gathered higher in the room. Between the two, the bakehouse had found a comfortable balance. Tessa could feel the difference when she stretched one foot toward the hearth and then drew it back. The fire gave a soft, enclosed murmur. Beyond it, Alder Brook continued past the mill with its low evening sound. Mina looked toward the covered loaf. "This part is mostly waiting. We've done quite a lot of that. It's good work when it's needed." Tessa rested her hands loosely on her knees. The flour had required a longer rest than they might have expected from such a small amount, but the extra time had not delayed anything. It had passed alongside the warming of the oven. One quiet need had fitted within another. After a while, the sound inside the oven changed. The last piece of wood had settled lower, and the flames no longer moved along its whole length. A deep red glow remained beneath it. Mina rose. Tessa joined her at the hearth. She lifted the iron latch, and Mina opened the door slowly. Warm air came forward in a steady breath, carrying the dry scent of embers and hot brick. The chamber was ready to be cleared. Tessa brought the metal pail in from the bare patch beside the step and set it on the brick floor near the oven, well away from the wood stack. Mina took up the poker. She drew the largest glowing pieces toward the oven mouth, working one at a time and making no hurried movement. Tessa held the small shovel ready. The first ember landed on it with a faint hiss of ash. Its center remained red, while a soft gray coating formed along the outer edge. Tessa lowered it into the metal pail. Mina brought forward another, and then another. They worked in an easy sequence. Draw forward, lift, lower into the pail. Wait for the loose ash to settle. The oven chamber gradually darkened as the brightest embers were removed. Heat still filled it, stored in the brick rather than carried by open flame. A few smaller coals remained near the back. Mina reached them with the poker and guided them forward until Tessa could gather them as well. When the last visible coal was in the pail, Mina used the hearth brush to sweep the fine ash toward the mouth. Her strokes were gentle enough that very little rose into the air. Tessa caught the ash on the shovel and added it to the pail. They did not try to make the hearth look unused. A thin gray trace remained over the brick, even and dry. That was expected. What mattered was that no live ember had been left where the loaf would rest. Tessa carried the pail outside and placed its lid over it. The metal remained on the bare ground beside the step, where it could cool safely through the evening. When she returned, Mina was standing near the open oven with one hand held well away from the chamber. "Still strong," she said. Tessa felt the heat from the same distance. It reached her palm at once. Too strong? For the loaf just now. That answer required no correction and no concern. The fire had done its work. The oven needed only a little time to settle from firing heat into baking heat. They closed the iron door, leaving the vent as Mina set it, and turned back to the bench. Tessa lifted the cloth from the loaf. The small round had broadened slightly on its board. Its upper surface remained smooth in the center, with the darker flecks making faint curved lines through the pale dough. It had not spread beyond its shape, it had only softened into it. Mina pressed one finger near the side. The mark returned slowly. "That's ready," she said. "So now the oven waits for the dough?" Only for a little while. Tessa replaced the cloth loosely. They cleared the last few things from the long bench. The empty trial bowl went onto the dry shelf. The salt crock stood beside it. Mina rinsed the scraper once more, and Tessa wiped the damp ring left by the water cup. The work had become lighter as the evening went on. At first there had been shelves to clean, wood to order, flour to mix, and warmth to build. Now the loaf was shaped, the chamber was heated, and the tools had already begun returning to their places. Tessa took the clean peel from beside the doorway. The broad wooden blade had dried completely. She ran her palm across it and felt no raised grain, only the smooth wear of long use. Mina opened the oven after the short interval. The first strong breath of heat had softened. Warmth still reached them clearly, but it no longer pressed outward with the same force. The brick gave back what it had gathered in a calm, even way. Mina studied the hearth and the upper curve of the chamber. Then she nodded. "That'll take it gently." Tessa set the peel beside the loaf board. Mina removed the covering cloth. Together they looked at the small loaf for a moment. It did not need further shaping. Handling it again would only disturb the rest it had been given. Tessa held the board steady while Mina eased the scraper beneath one edge of the dough. It had released cleanly from the light dusting of flour. Mina guided it toward the peel, and Tessa tipped the board by the smallest amount. The loaf slid onto the center of the wooden blade. It sat there neatly, still rounded, with the joined edges beneath. Tessa adjusted the peel so its weight rested comfortably in both hands. Mina stepped aside from the oven mouth. Tessa brought the peel forward. The heat warmed her hands around the handle. She moved the blade into the chamber until the loaf stood over a clear place near the center of the hearth. One short forward movement, then a gentle drawback, left the dough on the warm brick. The loaf settled without folding or leaning. Tessa withdrew the peel, and Mina closed the iron door. That was all. The small loaf was inside. The oven held a settled heat around it. Nothing more needed to be added, turned, or repaired. Tessa leaned the peel in its usual place at the meeting of brick and wall. Mina folded the loaf cloth and set it beside the cooling rack. They returned to their seats. The baking gave them less to watch than the fire had. No flame showed at the vent. No wood shifted or cracked. The oven stood closed and warm, its work taking place within the brick chamber. For some time they listened to the room. The brook remained steady in the distance. Leaves moved lightly beyond the door. The floorboard beneath Tessa's heel gave one quiet creak when she changed her position. A warm smell began to appear, so faint at first that it seemed to belong to the old flour in the bench seams. Then it grew clearer. Damp grain was losing its raw scent. The dough was becoming bread. Mina breathed in gently. It's taking the heat well. Tessa noticed the scent gathering near the oven and moving toward the doorway. It was modest, suited to the size of the loaf, but it changed the whole bakehouse. The room no longer smelled mainly of cool brick and dry wood. Warm flour had joined those scents and softened them. They let the loaf bake without opening the door. Tessa considered the shelf above the long bench. The bowls were nested. The salt crock was closed, and there was space enough for the few things the bakehouse would need on milling day. Later, she could label the shelf ends so each place remained clear even when the room was busier. That was gentle work, for after the loaf had cooled, when the oven no longer needed their attention. For now, she kept her attention on the warmth and the passing time. Mina stood once to test the outer brick. Tessa checked the closed vent and found it as they had left it. Neither spoke. The steady condition of the oven was answer enough. The smell of bread deepened. It reached the open door and mingled with the cooler garden air. Tessa imagined it passing only a little way along the path, toward the kitchen beds and the low orchard branch near the roof. By the time she returned to the mill later, some trace of it might follow on her apron and sleeves. Mina waited until the scent had become rounded and lightly toasted before she opened the oven. Warm air moved into the room. In the dim chamber, the loaf showed a soft brown across its upper curve. One shallow line had opened naturally near the side. It was not a tear that required attention, only the place where the loaf had made room as it baked. Tessa brought the peel. Mina looked closely at the nearer edge, and then at the color beneath it, a little longer. The oven door closed again. They resumed their seats. That final interval was brief, though neither measured it aloud. Tessa watched the amber edge of light beneath the iron door. Mina folded and unfolded one corner of her apron, smoothing it flat against her knee. When the oven opened again, the loaf's color had deepened by one quiet shade. Tessa slid the peel beneath it. The loaf had released from the hearth, its base firm enough to lift without catching. She drew it toward the oven mouth and carried it across the small room. Mina held the cooling rack steady. Tessa lowered the peel and eased the loaf onto the wooden slats. A faint dry sound came from the crust as it met the cooler air. The loaf was small and plainly shaped. Its top was brown, its sides a little paler, and the darker flecks from the trial flour remained visible beneath the baked surface. Warmth rose from it in a gentle current. Mina bent near enough to listen, though she did not touch it. The crust gave another tiny settling sound. "That's done," she said. Tessa set the peel back against the wall. They left the loaf uncovered at first, so the steam could pass freely around it. The rack raised it above the bench, and the open door kept the room from becoming close. Nothing needed to be cut while it was hot. Cooling was part of the test, just as resting had been part of the dough. Mina closed the oven door, leaving the chamber to keep its remaining warmth. Tessa wiped the loaf board and returned it to the upper shelf. Mina cleaned the last dust from the scraper and put it beside the mixing bowl. Their movements had grown quieter still, reduced to one object at a time. The loaf cooled on the rack between them. Its scent continued to fill the bakehouse, warm grain over old timber and brick. Tessa rested one hand near it, feeling the mild heat without touching the crust. The trial flour had completed its simple journey. It had come from the slowly turned stones, crossed the kitchen garden in a covered bowl, taken water by degrees, and softened through rest. Now it stood as a finished loaf, requiring nothing except time to cool. Mina sat down once more and Tessa joined her. They looked toward the rack rather than the oven. The active part of the baking was over. The heat was safely held behind iron and brick. The covered pail stood outside on bare ground. The wood stack remained orderly and well clear of the hearth. After a while, Mina touched the side of the loaf with 2 fingers. "Still warm," she said. "But it can rest here without us." Tessa nodded. They would wait a little longer before cutting the test loaf. After that, Mina could see the crumb, taste what the trial milling had made, and leave with the question fully answered. Tessa would still have the shelves to label, and the safe oven warmth to bank, before returning through the garden. For the moment, the loaf remained whole. The 2 of them sat in the mild bakehouse while its crust cooled and its inner warmth settled. Outside, the path back to the mill lay pale beneath the evening sky. Inside, every tool was clean, every ember was contained, and the next work would begin only when the bread was ready. The loaf cooled slowly on the wooden rack. At first, warmth still rose clearly from its crust. Tessa could feel it when she held her hand nearby, a mild current carrying the scent of baked grain. After a while, the current became softer. The loaf no longer gave small settling sounds, and the brown surface lost the faint sheen it had carried from the oven. Mina touched the side again with 2 fingers. "Cool enough now." Tessa stood and brought the small loaf board down from the shelf. Mina held the rack while Tessa lifted the loaf onto the board. Its base made a dry, light sound against the wood. The loaf felt firm beneath her fingers. It had very little weight, but it held the evening's work within it. The trial turning of the stones, the covered walk across the garden, the measured water, the longer rest, and the gradual warmth of the brick oven. Mina waited until Tessa had steadied the board on the clean bench. Then she cut through the center of the loaf. The crust yielded with a quiet crackle. Beneath it, the crumb was pale and close, with small, even openings and darker flecks from the slowly milled flour. A little steam remained near the middle. It lifted briefly from the cut surface and disappeared into the warm bakehouse air. They left the 2 halves apart for a moment. Tessa bent nearer, not to search for a fault, but to see what the flour had made. The crumb was slightly denser toward the base, as a small loaf often was, though it had baked through. No damp line remained in the center. The crust was thin along the sides and deeper where the top had browned. Mina pressed the crumb with 1 fingertip. It gave gently and returned. "That rest did it good," she said. Tessa touched the other half. The bread felt tender beneath the crust, with a little more texture than a loaf made from finer flour. So it didn't need anything added. No, it needed what it got: water and time, and a warm oven. Tessa smiled. "We had all 3. Mina cut a narrow piece from 1 half and divided it between them. They tasted it without adding anything. The bread was mild. The crust carried the faint toasted flavor of the brick oven, while the middle tasted plainly of grain. Its texture was not perfectly smooth, but the coarser flour gave it a quiet substance that suited the small test loaf. Tessa ate slowly, noticing how the crumbs softened as she chewed. There was no raw taste, no dryness that asked for more water, and no heaviness from too much handling. The flour had behaved exactly as the dough had suggested it would once it was allowed to rest. Mina finished her piece and brushed 1 crumb from her apron. "That tells us enough. For the full milling, for the bakehouse, and for this flour." Tessa looked at the 2 halves on the board. The test had answered every question they had brought into the room. The oven drew cleanly and warmed evenly. The trial flour took water slowly but well. The dough became supple through rest, shaped without trouble, and baked into a sound loaf. Nothing remained to be corrected before the bakehouse was used again. Tessa placed the loaf halves together, though the cut line remained visible. Mina laid the clean loaf cloth loosely over them, leaving the sides open enough for the last warmth to escape. The oven still held a deep, quiet heat behind its iron door. Tessa crossed to it and placed her hand near the outer brick. It was warm from the lower course to the arch above the mouth. The strongest heat had passed, but the chamber would remain useful for some time. You can bank that safely now. Tessa opened the iron door a little. No ember glowed inside. The swept hearth lay dim and evenly gray. Stored warmth came forward without smoke or flame. She left the door open only long enough to confirm the chamber was clear, then closed it again. Mina adjusted the vent until only a narrow passage remained. The oven would lose its heat gradually rather than holding the room at baking warmth. Tessa made sure the latch sat properly, neither loose nor forced tight. Outside the doorway, the covered ash pail remained on the bare patch of ground. Tessa went to it and held her hand above the lid without touching the metal. It still carried some warmth, though much less than before. "It can stay there until morning," Mina said from the doorway. Tessa nodded. The pail was covered, away from the timber wall, and clear of the garden path. There was no reason to move it while any warmth remained. She returned to the bakehouse and looked over the wood stack. The unused pieces stood in their ordered rows, larger wood below, lighter pieces above, and cut ends facing outward. The kindling box held enough dry slips and curled shavings for the next gradual firing. Mina untied her apron. She shook it once outside the door, gently enough that only a pale trace of flour left the cloth. Then she folded it and placed it in her shallow basket. Tessa carried the water pitcher to the threshold. Only a small amount remained. She poured it into the basin and rinsed the cup, then used the water to wash the last flour from her hands. The coolness felt pleasant after the oven's steady heat. Mina dried the cup with the unworn corner of one wiping cloth and set the cup upside down on the shelf. She spread that cloth along the shorter bench. Tessa opened the other used cloth beside it, smoothing both so the damp folds were exposed to the air. The wooden scraper remained beside the worn mixing bowl on the long bench. It was clean now and nearly dry, ready for Tessa to shelve when she marked the tool's proper place. The bakehouse was nearly returned to order. The difference was that it no longer felt like a room waiting to be opened. Its benches were clean, its tools had been used and kept within the room, and its brick held the settled warmth of completed work. Tessa lifted the cloth from the bread once more. The cut surfaces had stopped giving off steam. "You should take half," Mina said. Tessa separated the loaf along the cut. She placed one half in Mina's shallow basket beside the folded apron, setting it with the crust downward and the cut face open so its last warmth could escape. She left the other half on the loaf board beneath a loose fold of the clean cloth. "That one can finish cooling at home," Mina said, "and this one can come back to the mill kitchen." They stood for a moment beside the long bench. Their work no longer required them to wait together. The loaf had cooled enough to cut, the crumb had been seen and tasted, and the oven had been left in a safe, settled condition. Mina lifted her basket. It held only her folded apron and her half of the loaf. "Everything's ready here." Tessa looked around once more. The scraper was beside the mixing bowl. The wiping cloths remained open on the shorter bench. "It is. I'll see you when there's a larger batch. There'll be room for it." Mina gave a small nod and stepped through the doorway. Tessa followed her onto the path. The garden had darkened while they baked. Its rows were still visible as low shapes beside the narrow track, and the orchard stood beyond the bakehouse in quiet layers of leaf and branch. The mill windows showed a warm reflection beneath the roofline. Mina turned toward the lane, carrying the basket easily at her side. Her steps moved beyond the garden and softened as she went. Before long, they were no longer distinct from the evening sounds around Alder Brook. Tessa remained near the bakehouse door. Mina's part in the test was complete. She had seen the room prepared, helped warm the old oven, felt the dough before and after its rests, and tasted the finished bread. Nothing needed to be carried forward as a question for another evening. Inside, the shelves waited for their labels. Tessa returned to the long bench and brought out the plain labels she had set aside for the bakehouse. She arranged them in a short row, then considered the cleaned shelves. There was no need for a complicated system. The room held only a few kinds of things, each with an obvious use. Clear places would make the next visit easier, especially when more bowls and baking supplies came across the garden for milling day. She began with the upper shelf. The nested bowls remained together near the center. Tessa lifted the worn mixing bowl from the bench and placed it beneath them. She fixed the first label along the front edge. Mixing bowls. She pressed it flat with her thumb and stepped back. The words were simple and easy to read in the lamplight that would be used later. They named what was already there and asked nothing more of the shelf. The salt crock stood at one end. Beside it was space for other small baking supplies when they were brought from the mill kitchen. Tessa fixed the second label beneath that section, salt and small measures. The scraper belonged with the loaf boards on the lower shelf, near enough to the bench to be reached without crossing the room. Tessa took the clean, dry scraper from beside the bowl and set it in the open place next to the other board. The loaf board carrying her half of the bread would join them after the bread was removed in the mill kitchen. She added another label, "Boards and scrapers." The long-handled oven peel needed no shelf. It stood securely where the brick met the wall, its broad blade clear of the walking path. Tessa left it there, visible and ready. She moved to the wood stack. No label was needed to explain the larger split pieces. Their arrangement showed their purpose. But the kindling box held two useful groups, and keeping them separate would make the next fire as gradual as this one had been. Tessa straightened the driest slips on one side and the curled shavings on the other. She fixed a small label to the front of the box, "Kindling." That was enough. She did not label every open space. Empty shelf remained empty shelf, useful precisely because it could receive what was needed later. The labels marked the stable places and left the rest of the bakehouse free. Tessa read them once from the doorway, mixing bowls, salt and small measures, boards and scrapers, kindling. The words followed the same order as the evening's work. Bring the flour together, measure what it needs, shape it on the board. Warm the oven gently. Each part had a place, and each place could be found without searching. The remaining half loaf rested under its cloth on the clean board. Tessa turned to the oven again. Warmth still lingered in the bricks, though the room had begun to cool near the open doorway. She checked the iron door and found it firmly latched. The vent remained at the narrow setting Mina had chosen. There was no smoke, no flame, and no live coal inside. The heat would pass slowly into the room and then into the night. To bank the warmth safely, Tessa closed the bakehouse door partway, while leaving a clear opening for air. She watched the edge of one wiping cloth on the shorter bench. It stirred slightly, showing that the room still breathed. She carried the basin outside and emptied the clean rinse water onto the bare soil beside the garden path. Then she returned it upside down near the pitcher. The cloths used for wiping remained spread along the shorter bench rather than folded while damp. By morning they would be dry. The clean loaf cloth stayed around the bread. Tessa swept a few crumbs from the cutting place into her palm. There were very few. She carried them outside and scattered them onto the garden soil, then brushed her hands together. She made one final circuit of the bakehouse. The oven was latched and vented. The ash pail was covered outside on bare ground. The wood stood clear of the brick. The benches were wiped. The damp cloths were open to the air. The shelves were labeled. The scraper was under boards and scrapers. The door could close without catching against the sill. Nothing had been left near the hearth. Tessa lifted the half loaf and board. The bread had cooled enough to carry without trapping steam beneath the cloth. Its scent remained warm and clear, rising each time the fabric shifted against the cut crust. She stepped outside and drew the bakehouse door nearly closed behind her. For a moment she held it there and listened. The room made no sound beyond the slight settling of warmed timber. The oven's heat was safely contained in brick. Cool evening air continued through the narrow opening at the door. Tessa left the latch unset for now so the room could finish airing while the warmth faded. She would close it fully before the night was over. The return path to the mill was short, and the bakehouse stood plainly in view beyond the kitchen garden. She carried the loaf along the narrow path. The soil at the edges had cooled. Leaves in the orchard moved lightly behind her, and the brook's steady sound grew clearer as she approached the mill. The garden no longer held the day's warmth, but the loaf board was still mild beneath her hands. The scent of bread came with her. It lingered on her sleeves and in the cloth, crossing the garden more easily than the small bowl of flour had crossed it earlier. That outward journey had carried a question. The return carried its answer. The trial flour made good bread. Its texture asked for patience, and patience was enough. The bakehouse oven warmed evenly when fired in small stages. Its shelves were clean and marked. Its scraper, cloths, wood, and remaining warmth had all been left in their proper places. At the kitchen door, Tessa paused and looked back. The bakehouse rested beyond the garden, its dark roof beneath the orchard branch. No smoke showed above the chimney now. The doorway remained slightly open, just as she had left it, and the path between it and the mill was clear. Tessa entered the mill kitchen. The familiar warmth of the main building met her. She placed the loaf board on the table and folded the cloth back enough for the bread to finish cooling. A quiet scent of toasted grains spread through the kitchen, joining the warm wood and the faint trace of flour that belonged to the mill. Behind her, the garden path remained available for one final closing walk. Ahead of her, the kitchen offered a settled place to wait while the bakehouse released the last of its stored warmth. Tessa drew out a chair and sat beside the small loaf. For now, every question of the baking had been answered, every active fire was gone, and the return path lay calm between two orderly rooms. Tessa sat beside the half loaf while the last warmth faded from its cut face. The mill kitchen was quiet around her. Warm wood held the mild scent of the day, and a faint trace of flour remained in the seams of the table. The bread added its own deeper note, toasted at the crust and soft with grain beneath it. Each time the cloth shifted, that scent rose again and moved through the room. Beyond the kitchen door, the garden lay between the mill and the bakehouse. Tessa could see only part of the path from where she sat, a pale beginning that passed the nearest beds and continued into the evening. At its farther end, the bakehouse door remained slightly open. She had left it that way so the room could finish airing, while the stored oven warmth eased into the night. There had been no live ember in the chamber, no smoke at the chimney, and no heat left in the covered pail beyond the ordinary warmth of cooling ash. Even so, the final closing walk belonged to the work. Tessa would make it when the interval had done what it needed to do. For now, she waited. Alder Brook moved steadily beyond the wall. Its sound entered the kitchen without sharpness, passing beneath the smaller sounds of the building. One board settled near the doorway. The cloth around the loaf gave a dry whisper as its folded edge relaxed. Somewhere below, in the wheel room, The resting mechanism held its familiar stillness beside the water. The bakehouse evening had answered its questions. The old oven could be warmed gently after a long rest. Its chimney drew cleanly. Its bricks accepted the fire in small stages and returned an even heat. The trial flour took water more slowly than finer flour might, yet it needed no correction. Given time, it softened beneath Tessa's hands, held its shape, and baked through. The half-loaf on the table was enough to confirm all of that. Tessa placed her fingertips near the cut surface without pressing it. Only a little warmth remained. The crumb had settled fully now, close and even around the darker flecks. She drew the cloth over it, leaving a narrow opening at one side so no remaining warmth would be trapped. Nothing else in the kitchen required her attention. She sat a little longer, allowing the stillness to lengthen. The active stages of the evening had fallen away one by one. There was no flour left to measure, no dough to feel, no fire to tend, and no loaf waiting to be judged. Mina had gone home with her half of the bread. The cleaned tools had returned to their places. The labels lay flat along the shelf edges. Only the door remained to be closed. As Tessa rose, the chair moved back with a low scrape and became still. She crossed to the kitchen door and opened it wider. Cool air met her face and wrists. It carried the damp freshness of the brook, the dry scent of garden soil, and beneath both, the faintest warmth from the bakehouse bricks. Tessa stepped outside. The kitchen garden had lost the last clear color of evening. Its rows now appeared as quiet shapes, darker than the path between them. Leaves rested close to their stems. The taller plants made soft, uneven edges against the sky, while the lower beds merged gently with the earth. The orchard stood beyond the bakehouse. Its nearest branches moved only a little. The low branch beside the roof no longer showed individual leaves unless Tessa looked directly at it. Farther back, the trees gathered into a calm depth of trunk and shadow. Their fruit remained among the leaves, and a few windfalls rested unseen in the grass beneath them. They could wait. The orchard path would be the next ordinary task, but not tonight. On another evening, Tessa could clear its edges and gather the apples that had fallen naturally. There would be no need to shake the branches or hurry fruit from the trees. The sound ones could be carried to the milling day table, and the path could be made easy beneath the orchard's quiet shade. For now, the orchard needed nothing from her. Tessa followed the narrow garden path toward the bakehouse. Her steps were slower than they had been when she carried the bowl of flour earlier. The board had gone out from the mill cool and covered, holding the result of the wheel trial. The bread had returned warm beneath its cloth. That small circuit was complete. At the edge of the first bed, she paused and looked back. The mill kitchen window held a muted square of lamplight. It did not reach far into the garden. It simply marked the room she had left, with the half loaf resting on the table and the chair drawn slightly away from it. Above and beyond the kitchen, the larger mill stood dark and settled, its rooms arranged as they had been before she crossed the garden. Tessa continued. Near the bakehouse, the air felt a little warmer. The difference was slight, no more than the breath of heat that had passed through the narrow opening at the door. It carried the scent of brick and baked flour into the cooler garden. She placed one hand against the door. The timber was mild near the inner edge and cool toward the outer boards. Tessa opened it enough to step inside. The room had dimmed almost completely. She brought the small hand lamp from its place near the doorway and turned its flame up only until the shelves and hearth came into view. Soft light spread across the nearest bench. The bakehouse looked as she had left it. The damp wiping cloths rested open on the shorter bench, already drying at their edges. The loaf board's place on the lower shelf remained empty because the board was in the mill kitchen. Beside that space, the scraper lay clean and dry. The labels caught the lamplight in pale strips. Mixing balls, salt in small measures, bodes and scrapers, kindling. Tessa read each one without needing to change it. The lettering was clear. The stable places had names, and the open spaces remained free for whatever a larger baking day might require. She crossed to the oven. No warmth moved strongly toward her now. When she held her hand near the iron door, she felt only the quiet heat stored in the old brick. It was enough to keep the room mild, not enough to ask for further airing. Tessa touched the latch. It remained properly seated. She adjusted nothing at first. She stood beside the oven and listened. There was no crackle within the chamber. No smoke scent entered the room. The chimney made no sound beyond the air that always passed through an open flue. The oven had moved from fire to baking heat, from baking heat to banked warmth, and now from banked warmth toward rest. She opened the door briefly for one last view. The lamp showed the hearth as a flat gray surface. No red point appeared in the ash. No hidden coal brightened when the air reached it. The chamber was clear, just as it had been when Mina checked it before leaving. Tessa closed the iron door again and set the vent to its resting position. A narrow passage remained for the last heat and air. The oven would cool gradually through the night without holding the bakehouse closed around it. She rested her palm against the outer brick. Warm, then less warm as she moved her hand away from the mouth. The change was even across the old masonry. Nothing had heated sharply, and nothing had been left to smolder. The oven was safe. Tessa lowered the lamp and crossed to the outer door. Before closing it, she stepped onto the bare patch beside the threshold where the ash pail stood. Its lid remained in place. She held her hand above it. No warmth reached her now. When she touched the metal with the back of one finger, it felt cool beneath the evening air. Tessa lifted the lid carefully. The ash lay quiet inside, pale over the dark pieces that had once glowed. None showed light. None gave heat. She replaced the lid and made sure it sat evenly around the rim. The pail could remain on the bare ground until morning. Then the cold ash could be dealt with in daylight. Tonight it was contained, covered, and clear of both timber and path. She looked up toward the chimney. No smoke marked the sky. The dark line above the shingles stood still beneath the orchard branch. The bakehouse had released the last visible sign of its firing some time ago. Tessa went inside once more. She straightened one drying cloth where its corner had folded beneath itself. The cloth lay flat after that, open to the mild air. She turned the basin by a small amount, so it rested securely upside down beside the pitcher. Neither action was necessary to resolve a problem. They were only the final light movements of leaving a room ready. The wood stack required no change. Its larger pieces remained below, their cut ends facing outward. The lighter wood rested above. Inside the kindling box, the dry slips and curled shavings were separated as Tessa had arranged them. There was enough for another gradual warming, and the clear space around the brick remained open. She passed her hand over the long bench. The surface was dry. A few shallow marks of years of work showed beneath the lamplight, but no loose flour remained. The worn mixing bowl sat with the others on the shelf. The salt crock was closed. The peel leaned securely in its usual corner. The room was not waiting on any unfinished task. Tessa carried the lamp to the doorway and turned once more toward the oven. The light touched the iron latch, the front edges of the labeled shelves, and the clean boards of the bench. Behind those simple shapes, the rest of the bakehouse settled into shadow. She lowered the flame. The room dimmed until the last glow belonged only to the lamp in her hand. Then she stepped outside and drew the door toward her. This time she closed it fully. The lower edge passed the sill with the same slight resistance it had given when they arrived. Tessa lifted gently, and the wood settled into place. She lowered the latch and tested it once. The door held. Cool air surrounded her again. The warm trace from the bakehouse was already thinning, joining the scents of soil, leaves, and Alder Brook. Behind the closed door, the oven would continue cooling in an orderly room. Outside, the covered ash pail stood safely on bare ground. Tessa did not need to return again that night. She took the garden path back toward the mill. The way seemed shorter now that every part of the bakehouse work was done. Her hands were empty. She could let them hang easily at her sides while she walked. The orchard remained beyond her right shoulder. A leaf shifted, brushed another, and settled. The grass beneath the trees held the apples that had come down in their own time. Tessa would see them more clearly when she next walked there with a basket. She knew the narrow orchard path began beyond the kitchen garden and passed between the first trees. No further plan was needed tonight. Ahead, the kitchen window continued to mark the mill. The scent of bread met her before she reached the door. It had remained in the kitchen and on her sleeves, but it also seemed to have settled along the short path between the buildings. Flour had crossed one way. Bread had crossed the other. Warmth had followed both journeys, and now rested quietly in the places where the work had been done. Tessa entered the kitchen and closed the door behind her. The room felt warmer after the garden, though no new fire had been made. She returned the hand lamp to its place and adjusted the flame until it gave a low, steady light across the table. The half loaf waited beneath the cloth. Tessa lifted the board and moved it to the cooler end of the table, away from the lamp. She folded the cloth loosely around the bread, protecting the cut face while leaving the crust room to remain dry. In the morning, the loaf would be fully cool. It could be eaten without ceremony, a small, useful result from the trial flour. No further test was hidden within it. Its crumb had already been seen, its flavor tasted, and its needs understood. Tessa washed her hands at the basin. The water was cool. It removed the last faint trace of ash from one fingertip and the flour that remained near the base of her thumb. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth, hung it straight, and emptied nothing more. Then she made a quiet round of the kitchen. The loaf was covered. The lamp was steady. The outer door was closed. Through the window, the bakehouse showed only as a dark, familiar shape beyond the garden. Its door no longer made a pale opening. Its chimney stood clear against the dim sky. Tessa looked toward it for a few breaths. There was comfort in the absence of any sign that needed attention. No smoke, no moving light, no open door. The building had been warmed, used, cleaned, labeled, and closed. It had returned to rest without returning to neglect. She drew the chair closer to the table and sat again. This waiting was different from the earlier intervals. It served no dough and no oven. It was not a pause before another action. The evening's task had ended. Tessa could hear Alder Brook more clearly now that night had settled over the garden. Its sound passed the mill in one continuous low movement. The wheel remained quiet beside it after the earlier trial, and the rooms above held the grain loft's simple order. The bakehouse beyond the garden held the fading warmth of the small loaf. Nothing in those sounds suggested haste. Tessa folded her hands on the table. The day's work could be remembered in a few plain stages. A closed bakehouse had opened. Dust had been wiped from the benches. Wood had been stacked. Small fires had warmed the oven by degrees. Trial flour had taken water, tightened briefly beneath her hands, and softened when left to rest. The shaped loaf had baked in settled heat. Mina had tasted it, taken her half, and gone home. Tessa had marked the shelves, checked the chamber, cooled the ash, and latched the outer door. Each stage had ended before the next began. Now there was only the loaf, the clean room across the garden, and the mild bread scent that had followed Tessa back into the mill. The lamp flame moved once, when a small current passed beneath the kitchen door. It leaned, straightened, and became still. Tessa watched its light rest across the table boards. The cloth over the bread made a soft shape at the edge of the glow. Outside, the orchard kept its own slower order. The branches held what had not yet fallen. The grass received what had. The narrow path waited beneath them, needing only ordinary tending. When Tessa went there next, she would take a basket and begin at the garden end. She could clear the path as she walked and gather the sound windfalls without disturbing the trees. That work belonged to another evening. Tonight, the path needed no footsteps. The apples needed no sorting in darkness. The bakehouse needed no more checking. The mill kitchen asked for nothing beyond the lowering of the lamp when Tessa was ready. She remained beside the loaf while the room grew quieter. Warm wood, bread, a faint trace of flour, and the distant dampness of the brook made one settled air around her. The garden lay calm between the kitchen and the latched bakehouse. Beyond it, the orchard rested with its path and fallen fruit waiting safely for daylight. Tessa lowered the lamp a little more. The light drew inward across the table, leaving the farther shelves in shadow. The loaf remained within the smaller circle, covered and cool. Tessa sat with it until even the memory of oven heat had softened into the ordinary warmth of the mill. Night had settled over Alder Brook. The bakehouse was closed. The bread was resting. The next path waited beneath the orchard trees, and nothing needed to begin before its time.